Months ago, I had a life that looked exactly the way I'd planned it. A mortgage I was proud of, a job I'd worked 12 years to earn, a husband I thought I knew better than anyone on earth, and a best friend who had been beside me through every version of myself since we were 19 years old, sitting in the same sociology lecture at Dalhousie, sharing notes and bad coffee and everything that came after. 9 months ago, I lost all of it inside of 3 weeks. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because it's the most accurate way I know to describe what happened. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the entire architecture of my adult life to come apart. And the strange thing, the thing I still turn over in my mind sometimes when I can't sleep, is that I didn't see a single piece of it coming. My name is Laurel. I'm 38 years old. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I work in healthcare administration, or I did until I didn't anymore. That's where this story starts, I suppose. With the job, because the job was the first thing to go, and at the time I thought losing it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I had no idea. I'd been the regional coordinator for a network of community health clinics across HRM for almost 4 years. Before that, 12 years building up through the system, intake coordinator, program lead, regional assistant, all of it. The job wasn't glamorous. I managed budgets and staffing and compliance filings and the kind of meetings that run 40 minutes longer than they should. But I was good at it. I knew I was good at it. And then, one Tuesday in October, my director called me into her office and told me that the organization was restructuring, that my position was being eliminated, and that HR would be in touch about my severance package. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward for 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I just sat there, watching people walk in and out of the building I had just been told I was no longer part of, and I felt something I didn't have a word for yet. Something hollow and very still. I called my husband from the car. He said the right things. He said he was sorry. He said we'd figure it out. He said to come home and we'd talk. His name is... well, I'll call him my husband because the name doesn't matter anymore, and because by the time I get to the part of this story where he becomes relevant again, you'll understand why. I drove home. He wasn't there. I texted him. He said he'd been held up at work. He came home 2 hours later, and we sat at the kitchen table in our house in Bedford, the house we bought together 6 years earlier, the house where we talked about having children one day, and he told me it would all be okay. He was lying about almost everything by then. I just didn't know it yet. The first 2 weeks after losing my job were hard in the ordinary way. I updated my resume. I made calls, I had coffee with former colleagues. My husband was distracted but present enough. My best friend, I'll call her my best friend because she was, until she wasn't, took me out for dinner at that Italian place on Argyle Street we always went to when one of us needed to talk. She listened to me. She told me I was talented and this was their loss. She ordered a second bottle of wine and said, "You're going to land somewhere better, Laurel." I believed that. I believed her. I don't know exactly when I started noticing things. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like a slow accumulation of small wrongness. My husband's phone face down on the counter more than usual. A weekend fishing trip with a friend from work that seemed to have produced no fish and very little detail. My best friend canceling on me twice in a row, once for a reason that felt thin, once for a reason it felt thin, once for no reason at all. A shift in the temperature of rooms when I walked into them. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself I was stressed from the job situation and reading too much into nothing. I told myself the way my husband looked at his phone and then quickly looked at me was just guilt about something small, something work-related, something that had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with me. I found out on a Wednesday. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, not because it changes anything, but because I know people wonder. I found out because I came home early from an informational interview downtown. It had ended faster than I expected. And because my husband's car was in the driveway when it shouldn't have been. And because when I walked through the front door of my own home, I heard 2 voices upstairs. One of them was his. One of them was hers. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time. Long enough that I had time to think. No. Long enough that I had time to think. No. Long enough that I had time to think. There must be some other explanation. Long enough that I understood there was no other explanation and that some part of me had known something was wrong for weeks and had been refusing to look at it directly. I walked upstairs. I opened the bedroom door, and everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my closest friendship collapsed in the same instant. What happened next? The conversation, the things that were said, I'm not going to describe in detail because some things are not for other people, and I'm still deciding what belongs to me alone. What I will say is that my husband's first reaction was not remorse, it was irritation. An actual, genuine irritation, as if I had interrupted something, as if I was the inconvenience. My best friend cried. I think she was genuinely crying. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. I stood in my own bedroom doorway and watched her cry, and I couldn't feel anything at all. I was completely numb. The numbness lasted about 3 hours, and then it broke open all at once in the parking lot of a Shoppers Drug Mart on the way to my sister's place, and I sat in that parking lot and shook for a long time. My sister. She's 5 years older than me. She lives in Dartmouth. She's the most practical person I've ever known. Came outside and found me there because I'd called her and she'd heard that something was wrong from the first word I said. She sat with me in the parking lot until I could drive. She made me sleep on her couch that night. She didn't say anything that wasn't useful, which is the kindest thing I can think of to say about someone in a moment like that. The weeks that followed were the worst of my life. I'm not going to dress that up. My husband, and I'm using that word deliberately, because he was still legally my husband during all of this, moved quickly. I don't know if he'd been planning it or if he simply had better legal counsel than I did. But by the time I had processed enough of what had happened to even begin thinking about what came next, he had already spoken to a lawyer. He had already started separating our finances. He had already begun the quiet, efficient process of disentangling himself from everything we had built together in a way that left him with most of it. The house was the biggest thing. We had equity in that house. Not a fortune, but real money. 6 years of payments, a market that had been good to us. The way the separation was structured, and I will be honest that I did not have a clear enough head in those first weeks to fight effectively. I walked away with far less than my share. My lawyer told me later that I'd agreed to terms that nobody in my position should have agreed to. I know that now. I had enough for a few months of rent. I had my severance package from the clinic. 14 weeks, which sounds like something until you do the math on Halifax rent prices. I had my clothes and my books and my grandmother's dishes and nothing else that felt like mine anymore. My best friend disappeared. That's the only way I can describe it. No calls. No texts. No explanation beyond what I already knew. The friendship that I had carried for 19 years. That had been the one thing I counted on most consistently throughout my adult life. It simply stopped existing. The people we had known as a couple chose, mostly, not to get involved. Which is a polite way of saying they chose him. I found a room in a shared house in the north end of Halifax. 3 other people, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where someone always left dishes in the sink. I was 38 years old and sleeping in a room with a window that looked directly into the side of another building. And I lay in that bed every night and tried to figure out what any of this meant about my life. I applied for jobs. I went to interviews. I was rejected for a position I was overqualified for by about 6 years of experience, and I sat with that rejection longer than I should have. I started doing the kind of math that you do when you are scared. How long can I make this last? What happens after that? What is the absolute worst version of this, and can I survive it? And then my uncle called. My uncle, my mother's brother, is a quiet man. He's in his late 60s, retired now, lives in Truro. We were never especially close. He was the kind of family member you saw at Christmas and called on birthdays, steady and warm, but not frequent. His wife, my aunt, had died 18 months earlier. I had gone to the funeral. I had thought about him in the weeks after, in the distracted way you think about people when your own life is consuming all your attention. He called me on a Thursday evening. He said he'd been thinking about me, that he'd heard things hadn't been easy lately. He said something that has stayed with me almost word for word. Your aunt talked about you more than you probably knew, Laurel. She always said you had good instincts and that you were going to be fine even in the times when you couldn't see it yourself. I almost didn't ask what he meant. I almost just said thank you and moved on. Instead I said, I didn't realize she talked about me much. And he said, she left something for you. She's had it arranged for a while. I think it's time you came to pick it up. I drove to Truro the following Saturday. My uncle made tea. We sat in his kitchen for a long time. He asked about my situation carefully and I told him the broad strokes, more than I'd intended to. And then he went to the back bedroom and came out with a banker's box sealed with tape and my name written on the top in my aunt's handwriting. My aunt's name was June. She was my mother's younger sister. She had never had children of her own. She had worked for 30 years as an estate administrator, which I had always understood to be a kind of quiet and careful profession, but had never thought much about beyond that. She had been private and precise and had a dry sense of humor that showed up unexpectedly. She had been, I realized sitting in my uncle's kitchen, someone I had never understood as fully as I should have. Inside the box were documents. Legal documents, financial records, correspondence, a letter to me in her handwriting, sealed in a cream envelope. I opened the letter first. She had written it 2 years earlier, when she was first diagnosed. She said she had been watching my situation from a distance, my marriage, she meant, though she was careful about how she said it, and that she had some concerns she hadn't known how to raise. She said she was old-fashioned enough to believe that family looks after family in the quiet ways, even when no one asks. She said she hoped I would never need what she had prepared, and that if I didn't, I could simply set it aside. But if I did need it, she wanted me to have something solid under my feet. There was a registered account, an RSP and a TFSA, both in my name, that she had been contributing to for 11 years. 11 years. Since a conversation she and I had had once, over dinner, when I was 27 and just starting my career and had said, offhandedly, that I didn't really understand how any of it worked yet and kept meaning to figure it out. She had apparently taken that conversation very seriously. There was also a property, a small house she owned outright in Annapolis Royal, that she had purchased years ago as an investment and had been renting out. She had transferred it into a trust with me as the beneficiary. Not a mansion, a modest old house with a good roof and a yard and, I found out later, when I called the property manager, a rental history that had been solid for 8 years. The accounts together were worth a little over $90,000. I sat in my uncle's kitchen and stared at those documents for a long time. He refilled my tea without saying anything. He waited. He was very good at waiting. I finally said, "Why didn't she tell me?" He said, "You know what she was like. She didn't want you making decisions differently because you knew it was there. She wanted it to be for when you actually needed it, not a cushion that changed how you lived." That was so precisely like her that I almost laughed. I drove back to Halifax in a kind of daze. Not the hollow, terrible daze of the parking lot at Shoppers Drug Mart, not the stunned numbness of standing in my bedroom doorway, something different. Something I didn't fully have a name for yet. Something that felt, tentatively and with some suspicion, like the ground reappearing under my feet. I called a financial advisor that week. Not the one my husband and I had used together, a different one, someone a colleague recommended. A woman with an office in Clayton Park who sat across from me and went through everything my aunt had arranged and said, very matter-of-factly, "She did this correctly, this is set up well, you're in a real position here." I hadn't been in a real position in months. I cried in her office, which embarrassed me, and she handed me a box of tissues with the efficiency of someone who had seen this before. I told my sister. She went quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "June always paid closer attention than any of us gave her credit for." That was it. That was all she said, and it was the right thing. I decided not to sell the Annapolis Royal property right away. I decided to keep the rental income and let myself think clearly for the first time in months. With the breathing room, I could be deliberate. I could take the job I actually wanted instead of the first one that would have me. The job I ended up taking is with a provincial health authority. It's a step up from where I was. More responsibility, better salary, a team I respect. I started in February. I'm still there. But before all of that, before the new job, before the financial meetings, before I could even begin to think about what my life was going to look like, there was one more thing. The property records my aunt had included in her documents were thorough. She had been an estate administrator for 30 years. Thoroughness was simply how she operated, and included in those records was correspondence with a lawyer about a property dispute that had involved my husband's family business, years before I'd met him. The kind of dispute that had been settled quietly in a way that my aunt had found professionally troubling. She had documented it. She had kept records of it. Not because she was planning anything, I believe. But because she was planning anything, I believe. But because she was the kind of person who documented things that troubled her. Those records went to my lawyer. My lawyer took them seriously. The short version of what followed is this: the separation agreement I had signed under duress without a clear enough head was reopened. The financial conduct during our marriage, specifically the way marital assets had been moved and structured in the lead up to our separation, in ways that had not been disclosed, came under scrutiny. My husband retained new counsel and became considerably less irritated and considerably more worried. I did not get back everything I should have had from the beginning. That rarely happens. But I received a significantly revised settlement that reflected something closer to what was actually fair. My lawyer said the documentation my aunt had kept was what made the difference, that without it, she wouldn't have known where to look. My best friend called me once during all of this. It was a short conversation. She said she was sorry. I said thank you. There was a long pause, and she said she hoped I was okay, and I said I was, because by then I was starting to be. I don't think we'll talk again. 19 years is a long time, and I will carry that grief quietly for a while longer. But I also know now that grief and forward are not opposites. You can carry the one and still move toward the other. My uncle came to Halifax for my birthday in March. We had dinner at a restaurant on the waterfront, just the two of us, and he asked how things were going, and I told him the truth. He was pleased in his quiet way. He said June would have wanted to know things worked out. I said I thought she probably already knew somehow that they would. He said he thought so too. I am not the same person I was a year ago. I am not going to tell you that I'm grateful for what happened, because I'm not exactly. I would not choose to have stood in that doorway. I would not choose the room in the North End or the parking lot breakdown or the months of sitting in the hollowed-out feeling of a life that had been taken apart while I wasn't paying attention. But I know something now that I didn't know before. I know that the people who love you don't always announce it loudly. Sometimes they are quiet about it for a decade. Sometimes their love looks like careful paperwork and a banker's box with your name on it, waiting in a back bedroom for the moment you finally need it. My aunt paid attention when I was 27 and didn't know how anything worked yet. She kept paying attention, quietly, for 11 years. She never said a word about it. She just made sure that when the worst happened, I would not be standing on nothing. I think about that a lot. I think about the people in your life who are paying attention to you in ways you don't see. I think about how easy it is to mistake quiet love for absence. How easy it is to be so focused on the loud, visible, present relationships that you forget the ones that run deeper. She was the crazy aunt in a way. Not dramatically, she wasn't eccentric or difficult, but she was the one at family gatherings who sat in the corner and watched, who asked careful questions and actually listened to the answers, who most of us found slightly hard to read. She was the one who kept records of things that troubled her professionally, just in case. She was the one who had been quietly, methodically watching over me for over a decade. She was the only one who prepared. I live alone now, in a one-bedroom apartment in the south end of Halifax, and I have learned to cook things I never bothered to learn before. And I have a job that challenges me in ways that are good. And I have my sister and my uncle and a few friends, different friends. Friends who showed up when things were hard, and I have the knowledge that somewhere in Annapolis Royal there is a small house with a good roof that belongs to me and no one else. It is not a fortune, it is not a dramatic ending, but it is mine, and I built nothing of it on lies. And on the days when I drive home from work and park my car and walk up to my own front door, I feel something that I am still getting used to feeling. I feel like I landed somewhere solid. June would have appreciated that, I think. Nothing too loud, just solid, just real. That's enough. That's more than I thought I'd have 9 months ago in a parking lot in October, sitting in the dark and shaking. That's everything. I've thought a lot about what made any of this possible. Not the accounts, not the property deed, not the lawyer who reopened the settlement. I mean the thing underneath all of that, the reason there was anything to find in that banker's box at all. June paid attention. That's it. That's the whole explanation. She sat at family dinners and listened carefully when everyone else was talking over each other. She remembered a throwaway comment I made at 27 about not understanding how RSPs worked. She watched my marriage from a distance and felt something was off before I did, and instead of saying anything, because she knew I wouldn't have heard it, she quietly made sure I'd have solid ground under my feet if the worst happened. She didn't do it for credit. She didn't do it expecting thanks. She did it because she thought it was the right thing to do, and then she died without ever telling me. That kind of love takes a particular kind of character. It takes patience, And it takes honesty with yourself about what you can and can't control. And it takes the wisdom to know that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer someone isn't words. It's preparation. It's the quiet, unglamorous work of actually doing something, even when nobody's watching. Even when the person you're doing it for has no idea. I think about the other side of that equation too. My husband and my best friend made choices over a long period of time. Not one bad decision in a moment of weakness, a sustained series of choices every single day to deceive someone who trusted them. And I used to think about that with a lot of anger. I spent months being angry. But what I've come to understand is that the choices you make over time, in the small, private moments when you think no one's looking, those choices build something. They build the kind of person you become. My husband and my best friend built something too. They built a version of themselves that had to live with what they'd done and eventually had to answer for it because my aunt had kept records and my lawyer knew where to look. I didn't set out to get justice. I was too broken in those early months to think that clearly, but the truth has a way of becoming visible eventually, not because of anything mystical, but because deception requires ongoing maintenance and honesty doesn't. The lies my husband told had to keep being told. The documentation June kept just had to sit in a box and wait. What I carry forward from all of this, and I think about it genuinely, not in a greeting card way, is something about how I want to live. I want to be someone who pays attention the way June paid attention, who does the quiet work even when it's thankless, who keeps her word even when it's inconvenient, not because I expect it to be rewarded, but because I've seen now what it looks like when someone lives that way over a long period of time, and I've felt what it means to be on the receiving end of it. I also want to be honest about something. The hardest part of this whole year wasn't the job or the house or even standing in that doorway. The hardest part was the 6 weeks after, when I was in that room in the North End and I genuinely didn't know what I was building toward anymore. When the person I thought I was capable, settled, on the right track, had dissolved, and I hadn't yet figured out who was left. What got me through that wasn't the money. The money came later. What got me through was my sister sitting with me in a parking lot without saying anything unnecessary, and my uncle making tea and waiting, and the slow recognition that I was still here, still thinking, still capable of making good decisions even inside a bad situation. That's not nothing. That's actually everything when you're at the bottom of it. June knew that about me before I did. She left a box with my name on it and trusted that I'd figure out the rest. I'm trying to be worthy of that.